righty. I would like to welcome all of you back and would like to thank uh, Larry Robinson and Mac so much for the assistance that they are providing. Uh, it saves me at least some of the potential pitfalls in doing these shows. Larry has always gotten it right and does a good job, not just of this, but in so many other things around Mac, as I understand it. So, where were we? We were in late May, early June 1942, when and we're back to my busy chart, which I somewhat apologize for, but this one I think is important in that it shows the complexity of the plan that Admiral Yamamoto had put together for the purpose of getting the U.S. aircraft carriers to come to the rescue of Midway Island and be trapped by the Japanese carriers, which would be there waiting for them. That is, if they got through a line of submarines. But Yamamoto, in this event, had gone to sea. At the Pearl Harbor attack, he had stayed on his flagship in Japan, and Admiral Nagumo had been in command of the actual operation. Nagumo was still in command of the aircraft carrier group, but it was part of a larger group of several different formations spread all over the ocean. And it's very curious looking back why Yamamoto did this. He was not really able to participate much because he was many miles away from the carriers, and he had to keep strict radio silence. So if he saw something going on he didn't like, he wasn't able to do anything. Had he been back in Japan, they would have been free. The U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral Nimitz, on the other hand, stayed in his headquarters in Hawaii, and he and his staff were able to play a significant role in whatever went on in the potential battle. Now, the American carriers had left in two groups to go to the vicinity of Midway Island, Midway Atoll, to prepare to surprise the Japanese, who were had come down to a point a couple hundred miles off Midway to attack the Midway's airfields and planes, and hopefully to draw the U.S. carriers from Hawaii. But the U.S. carriers had gotten past the Japanese submarine line before they arrived and were now ready to surprise the Japanese with the submarines were not going to be able to play much of a role in the coming battle. Now, Midway was absolutely stuffed full of airplanes. Admiral Nimitz got every aircraft he could get a hold of and had them fly out to Midway. There were so many that there was hardly any room on the ground for any more aircraft, and they were a real conglomeration of a number of different types of aircraft by different services. There were Navy pilots, Marine Corps pilots, Army Air Corps pilots, all ready to help defend Midway, but without any real coordination. They didn't have the time to make any detailed plans as to how they would do it. They just got to Midway with the weapons that they could bring with them and whatever Nimitz could get there. Among the planes that were at Midway, there were a group of fighter planes, which 2 or 3 years before had been state of the art. But the Rooster Buffalo, as it was called, was a short-looking plane, which would be much to the disadvantage of the Japanese Zero in aerial combat. The U.S. had a lot of patrol aircraft, in particular the PBY Catalina, which was an excellent airplane. It had a very long range and could fly either high enough or low enough to spot ships at sea, which is a very difficult thing to do. I think you might figure, well, gee, all you got to do is look down and there they are. But there are a lot of clouds over the ocean, particularly the Pacific Ocean, various times of year, and you can fly over a huge formation of ships without ever seeing them. And that exact thing happened during the course of this battle. But Midway was as ready as it could be. And on the fleet, out in the fleet, you had 3 aircraft carriers. There were 2 admirals in command, Admiral Spruance, who had taken Admiral Halsey's place, not an aviator, and he commanded a group of 2 carriers, the Enterprise and Hornet. Fletcher commanded a group that included 1 carrier, the Yorktown, but since he was senior to Spruance, he was in charge of the entire operation. Now, as we're getting close to the 4th of June, the U.S. On Midway send out search planes, mainly PBY Catalinas, to look for the Japanese fleet. Now, back in Honolulu, Nimitz has got to be extremely nervous at this point. He has talked Admiral King, the top man in the Navy, into letting him send all of his carriers out to combat an attack on Midway, which they can't be 100% sure is going to happen. They're relying solely on radio intelligence from Commander Rochefort's unit. And so Spruance for Nimitz has got to be really nervous at this point. Well, at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of June, one of the PBYs sights a group of ships. They get close as they can, circle around them, and realize it's the transport group carrying the troops that are attacking Midway. Well, Nimitz was incredibly relieved at this point because this is the first solid evidence they have outside of radio intelligence that the invasion is going to take place, that there are ships heading for Midway. So the plan moves forward. The PBYs finding the invasion force. Well, they send out all of the Army B-17s to attack the Japanese transports. And they find them, they drop a lot of bombs, and they don't hit anything. So they fly back to Midway to wait to see if they can do something on the following day. But that night, the commanders at Midway decide to try to do something to attack the Japanese.
So this is a real jury rig operation. They hook a torpedo under the wing of a PBY, which is not designed as an attack aircraft. They fly out, they find the Japanese transport force, and the pilot launches the torpedo and hits the ship. This is, although it did not sink it, but this was the first time in the attack after a number of bombs being dropped by the Army Air Corps. This was the first time that there was a hit on a Japanese ship. Even though it didn't sink it, it was a landmark occasion. Now, on the Japanese aircraft carriers, pretty much according to plan, that 6:30 in the morning. I'm not sure I've got that time right. Anyway, at an early time in the morning of June 4th, Admiral Nimitz orders the launch of aircraft that are to strike Midway. And this is a formidable group of planes that a number of bombers and accompanying fighters that are the aircraft types are pretty much all superior to anything the United States has on Midway. The Japanese also have started a search operation very early hours, 4:30 in the morning. There were 2 planes from the aircraft carriers searching to the west of Midway, and then a number of planes from cruisers. The cruisers would carry airplanes like this that were literally shot off of catapults into the air that flew out on their search mission, and they coming back, couldn't land on the ship. They would land in the water next to the ship and be hoisted on board. But there were a number of these planes, float planes, out searching for the U.S. Navy fleet. Now, the Army Air Corps and Navy Catalinas were also searching. The Army at first was directed out to attack the transports again, but when we got news that the Japanese fleet was definitely there, they were diverted to attempt to attack the Japanese carriers. On the way in, the Japanese planes were intercepted by a number of U.S. planes, mostly the Brewster Buffaloes, which did shoot down a few of the attacking planes, but for the most part were shot down themselves. The U.S. Attack planes, most of them got past the fighters, which were there to defend their bombers, and went on to try to bomb the Japanese fleet. The damage that was done at Midway was extremely significant, at least to the people on the ground. There were hangars were hit, ammunition dump was hit, and a number of other things on the island were hit. However, the Japanese flight commander decided there wasn't enough damage done and said to Admiral Nimitz that he thought they needed another attack. In the meantime, the U.S. Conglomeration of various aircraft started arriving at the Japanese fleet, and they found targets this particular group of fairly new Marine Corps aircraft had a very experienced aviator in command, Major Lofton Henderson. But most of his pilots were brand new. They were not schooled in dive bombing tactics, so he had them fly in fairly low and try to drop their bombs to hit the Japanese ships from a different angle. It was essentially a futile operation. Almost all of the Marine pilots were killed, including Major Henderson. We will hear his name a little later on in the course. But in the meantime, the planes were continuing to drop bombs on the Japanese with no results. Now you can see in this picture, all these are bomb splashes. But the ships, this is an aircraft carrier, maneuvering, and the ships were going as fast as they could and twisting and turning, and were successfully avoiding the attacks. So far, nobody on the U.S. side did anything. Now, Nagumo, in response to the leader of the flight attacking the island of Midway, decided to grant his request and send another attack against Midway. Now, his instructions from Admiral Yamamoto had been to keep half of his planes ready to attack enemy aircraft carriers. And this requires a different kind of weapon. If you're attacking a land target, you use weapons that use bombs that explode almost immediately on contact. If you're attacking ships, you use, in addition to bombs, you use torpedoes, and the bombs you use are designed to bombs designed for land attack off of the planes and replacing them with either torpedoes or bombs. And this part winch it up. It takes a lot of manpower and a lot of time to do this. But Nagumo didn't think he was in any serious danger of Japanese initial attack force on its way back now from Midway. And on the ships, they are rearming. They've got lots of bombs and torpedoes just flying around. But Nagumo had two very experienced aviators. He himself was not an aviator, but he was being advised by two people who very definitely were. So at this point, things are looking fairly good. Then he gets a report from one of the search planes. And this was a plane that had been delayed in takeoff. It was the last of the search planes to go. If it had left on time, it might have gotten him word even earlier, although scholars are now debating that question. But in any event, he got a report that didn't get to him until about 8:20 in the morning. Well, he had the rearmament already going. And the first report was of only cruisers and battleships. They didn't report any carriers. And it took them a while to finally get a report that there were aircraft carriers out there. Although the aviators, when they got the first report, were telling Nagumo that there've got to be carriers. They're not going to send other ships out there without a carrier. But finally, at 8:20 in the morning, he gets the report. And he orders a reversal of the rearmament. Now, at this point, there are a lot of planes that are sitting there that have their armed for land attack. There are other planes that objects of the aircraft carriers as they rush and try to get rearmed. Now, Nagumo has 4 carriers in this group. He's in immediate command of 2 of them, as well as the entire fleet. The other 2 carriers are commanded by Admiral Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi is an aviator, and he is very aggressive-minded, much more so than Nagumo, and he flashes a message suggesting an immediate attack. That means an attack with whatever planes are properly armed, just get them in the air and start hitting the U.S. ships. But Nagumo says no. He's basing his decision on Japanese doctrine, which is that you don't attack until you've got everything ready and you make a coordinated attack. You don't do it like the U.S. is apparently doing in this operation, just send planes in helter-skelter to get shot down one at a time. So the rearmament went on. There are planes in the air from the Midway attack that are soon going to run out of fuel. The planes for an attack on the U.S. carriers are being rearmed on the flight decks. It's a very confused and very dangerous situation. And the attacks from Midway-based aircraft are still continuing. The Japanese ships are circling and twisting, and still there are no hits against them. Now, in the U.S. fleet, Admiral Fletcher, who is in command of everything, gave an order early on to Admiral Spruance to attack as soon as he got within a reasonable range. They were not at that time close enough to attack successfully. Well, Spruance waits until they are in range, although it is an extreme range, and he orders his planes off as soon as they can get going. He wants them off. Now, the Hornet is ready right away to launch aircraft, and they do so very quickly. They But before they are ready to attack, they have a conference among the captain of the ship, Mark Mitchner, who was captain when the time of the Doolittle raid, who has been selected to be rear admiral, who's a highly experienced naval aviator. The aircraft on the ship are under the command of Commander Stanhope Ring. Ring was someone who, you might say, looked the part. He was handsome, tall, handled himself very well in social situations. He had been naval aide to President Herbert Hoover. He looked like you would think you would want a naval aviator to look like. But Ring was not all that great an aviator. He had done a few things that were not done right in the course of his career. And he was also a very discipline-minded officer. The aviators weren't used to strict discipline. Well, Ring behaved as if they were peacetime assignment ashore. He had one officer confined to his quarters for several days because he didn't stand up when Ring entered the room. And he was not much liked. They had a conference with Mitchner, Ring, and the air group commanders, the dive bomber, torpedo, and fighter plane. The commander of the torpedo planes, John Waldron, argued that he should get fighter support because torpedo planes have to fly low. They're slow aircraft. They're quite vulnerable when they're on a torpedo run. But Ring decided, Mitchner backed him up, saying no fighters. It got to the point where Waldron said, give me just one fighter. I'll even have one of my men fly it. But I guess by that point they were either chuckling at him or mad at him, but they decided, no, we're not going to do that. So planes from the Hornet took off, got into the air on their way. Now, Ring in command had his pilots fly in perfect formation, which takes more fuel than if you're not trying to be all that close to one another. But he wanted everything to look like it was a parade. On the way, Waldron reached a point where he said, and he said this on the radio that all the other pilots could hear. He said, I think we're going in the wrong direction. I know where the Japs are, and you're not hitting for them. Well, you can imagine Stanhope Ring's reaction to this. And he ordered Waldron to stay with him. But Waldron flew off on his own. Certainly something he can be court-martialed for when they get back. Well, Ring flew on, and his planes started getting to the point where their fuel was reaching the point where they're not going to be able to get back to the carriers. And first the fighter planes, one by one, started turning back, heading back for the carriers without really any orders to do so. They one after another followed each other, and the commander of the fighter planes was all alone up there with the dive bombers. So he too turned back. So the dive bombers went on without any fighter protection. And of course, the torpedo planes were flying toward the target with no fighter protection. And soon even the dive bombers started getting low on fuel and headed back. And it got to the point where Stanhope Ring was flying the only plane in the formation. And finally, he turned around and they all were headed back. A lot of them had to ditch, land in the water. Some of them made it to Midway Atoll and the friendly airfields, although it wasn't very friendly reception for many of them because the U.S. anti-aircraft crews on Midway were shooting at anything in the air. A couple of them, of the returning dive bombers, did get shot down by friendly forces. This operation became known as the Flight to Nowhere. Ring had led his planes, a full carrier load of dive bombers and fighter planes, several hundred miles around the Pacific. They never saw a Japanese ship, much less dropped a bomb. And they either ditched their bombs on the way back or took them back to the ship. It was a totally fruitless operation. In the meantime, though, Commander Waldron, who was, at least said he was part Indian, and at the Naval Academy had been called the Indian by some people, he was sure he knew where he was going. And he headed for the Japanese fleet. His planes were armed, each of them with the torpedo. This is an actual photograph of Waldron himself flying his plane off of the Hornet on the 4th of June, 1942. But they had no fighter escorts as they found the Japanese fleet, which they did. Waldron was right. He knew where they were. He found them, but all too soon they found him. He led his planes on a torpedo run, flying low, flying slow, and very soon the Japanese Zeros began to attack. The torpedo planes did have a gunner, a rear seat gunner, and they did manage to shoot down a few of the Japanese Zeros. But there were far too many of the Zeros. There was also anti-aircraft fire coming from the ships that were under attack. And one by one, the planes and Waldron's group, as they got closer to the carrier, were shot down either by anti-aircraft fire from the aircraft carriers or by the Japanese fighter planes. They had very little chance. Very early on, Waldron, who was in the lead, was shot down. This is not an actual photograph of him, but he was apparently last seen standing on the wing of his plane. And he was never seen again. As an aside, I remember when I was my first midshipman cruise, there was a ship named the USS John Waldron. And a little after that, I started doing some in-depth reading about the Battle of Midway. And when I first came across the name of John Waldron, I said to myself, oh my gosh, this is not going to end well for him because they've named a ship for him. But Waldron was lost. One after another of his flyers were lost. Now, Ensign George Gay was the last plane. He was the squadron navigator. And indeed, Waldron had a quick chat with him just before they left, saying, I may do something different. If you see me doing it, follow me. And Gay did follow him. He watched. It had to be a horrifying experience to have yourself being shot at while you see one after another of your squadron mates go down to almost certain death as they land in the Pacific. Gay, though, being perhaps because he was the last plane, lucky, got in close enough to drop his torpedo. It's not clear. He thought he scored a hit, although if he did, it was a dud torpedo, of which unfortunately there were very many at that time. But he dropped his torpedo. Now, all around him was gunfire, airplanes, and for about 5 seconds, he was in the safest place in the entire area. He flew right down the flight deck, very low, and of course, nobody was going to shoot at a plane that close to the aircraft carrier. But once he got beyond the flight deck, everything broke loose on him. And he was able to somehow get past. Finally, his plane wouldn't fly anymore. He managed to land it. His rear seat gunner apparently had been hit and was dead. Gay managed to get out of the plane, get the life raft and life jacket, and into the water before the plane sank. He was there, I think, about 2 days. The first few hours, he had to be very worried because there were Japanese ships all around him, which would love to have captured him to get information about exactly what was going on with the U.S. fleet. As it turned out, George Gay was the sole survivor of that entire torpedo squadron. Waldron, all the rest of the pilots and gunners had been lost in the attack. It was a devastating situation, and still no hits on the Japanese fleet. Now going to the carrier Yorktown. They had gotten closer to the Japanese, and by luck or brilliant navigation or whatever, they were able to fly straight to the Japanese fleet. And their torpedo squadron went in for an attack. And it was much like the situation when Waldron and his squadron attacked. One after another, they were shot down, although I think in this case, maybe 2 of the planes managed to survive, but they didn't hit anything. And by now, the Japanese fleet had been under attack by dozens and dozens of American airplanes, dropping bombs, dropping torpedoes, in a few cases, strafing the ships. They flew over them, but not a hit, nothing. Uh, Now we go to the third of the U.S. ships, the carrier Enterprise. Uh, this had been Admiral Halsey's flagship. It was Admiral Spruance's flagship. And their aircraft took off. Again, they were not in much of a coordination mode, but the aircraft of each type stayed together. Now, the air group commander in this case was much different from Stanhope Ring. He was an outstanding aviator. He had been a fighter pilot most of his career. He was recently put in charge of all aircraft squadrons on the Enterprise, and he decided he would fly in a dive bomber. Now, this group went out on their run. They got to where they thought the Japanese should be. Nobody there. And they didn't have much time to find the Japanese. They started a search pattern. And this is another busy chart, which I apologize for, but they we have the Waldron's torpedo planes leaving the rest of what became the flight to nowhere. We have the torpedo planes from the Yorktown making a failed attempt to attack the Japanese. And we have the group of the group from the Enterprise dive bombers flying on, almost ready to run out of gas. But this time, the fate of the battle really hinged on what had happened with a United States submarine, old submarine, but a very big one, the USS Nautilus. It, I think, was the sole submarine of either Navy on June the 4th to sight an enemy ship. And it did sight them, the whole fleet. And the commander moved in, managed to fire at least one spread of torpedoes, which either didn't hit or bounced off. And then all hell broke loose for the Nautilus because destroyers started chasing them. He dove down to his maximum depth. His depth charges were falling above him, shaking the ship. They were certain at times that the ship was going to be destroyed. And he wanted to surface, wanted to keep chasing the Japanese fleet, but they had detached one destroyer to keep him down. And the destroyer did a good job of that. They kept the Nautilus underwater, unable to attack the fleet until they were far enough away to not have to worry about the Nautilus. And then the Japanese destroyer headed back at very high speed, making a very big V-shaped wake afterward. And as it was on its way, the group in the Enterprise dive bomber squadron noticed this wake, this ship. Well, Wade McCluskey realized at once that a ship heading that fast is, number one, got to be Japanese, and number two, headed toward the aircraft carrier. So he turned and flew over the destroyer and the direction it was going, and very soon saw signs of ships in the distance. As they got closer, he realized this was it. This was the Japanese fleet, and soon they could see two aircraft carriers, and they got close enough, and he was really surprised that there were no Japanese fighters around. The reason that there were no Japanese fighters around is that they had flown low to attack the U.S. torpedo aircraft, leaving the sky open for dive bombers to attack should any of them show up. Well, McCluskey did show up. And as he started the dive, there was some confusion. In fact, there was some very serious confusion. There were two squadrons of them. The doctrine for attack was that the squadron that was furthest ahead should attack the aircraft carrier furthest away. And they were seeing two carriers down there. But for whatever reason, McCluskey, perhaps having been a fighter pilot, wasn't aware of this. And his squadron, instead of flying for the far carrier, flew for the near one. And so, of course, all of his planes followed him. Now, the planes in the other squadron knew that that was to be their target. So they started headed for the same ship. At this point, they were the McCluskey group. A huge number of them were attacking the aircraft carrier. The carrier Kaga was not going to make it. All of the armament rattling around the flight decks. Burning up and obviously out of the battle and almost certainly out of the war. The other squadron was commanded by Lieutenant Richard Best, who was very experienced dive bomber pilot. They had been in combat already. In a perfect place. And
well, that ain't even worth watching.
a number of other explosions. His two wingmen probably
Battle of Midway.
There's a little debate, but
Yeah.
they had near misses.
It's freezing up all the way. Yeah.
The flagship was out of the war. Now, on the with very few fighters and a lot of bombers and
Oh, well.
down low attacking torpedo planes, and they got a clear shot, and they started getting hit.
Very good, huh?
Minutes of the first success. Planes that could to get off the
Mhm. Yeah.
fuel lines, to empty them, to get weapons out of.
I think we're having trouble with sound.
Control. Japanese were interested in offense, which is a great mistake because on the Yorktown, in very little time, they were able to get the fires under control. And how the ship, though, was badly damaged, and Admiral Fletcher was lowered down into a boat, and he reportedly said at the time, "I'm too old to do this kind of thing." But he did transfer to a cruiser, leaving Admiral Spruance now in command of the operation. But the Yorktown's crews kept working, and they were able to save the ship and to put out all the fires. It was getting late in the day, but the Enterprise, which had already done magnificent work, sent out another strike against the only remaining Japanese carrier. And one of the men leading it was Lieutenant Best once again. And he did something that only one other naval aviator did in the entire Pacific War. He hit 2 aircraft carriers on the same day. And his hits and those by others put the Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, into very quickly shape where it was unusable and unsalvageable. And although it remained afloat for a good while, it eventually sunk, and Admiral Yamaguchi decided to go down with the ship. And so one of the best Japanese carrier admirals, their fleet, was lost for the future. Now, the 4 Japanese carriers are out of order. But there are a lot of other ships in the Japanese fleet. Spruance considers trying to attack them. It's getting dark. Our planes can't yet operate at night, or at least without taking tremendous risks. He thinks about it. He and his staff calculate the chances and decide that this isn't going to work. So he turns away so that he can avoid being attacked by the Japanese. Yamamoto, by this time, has got to be just beyond upset, in a state of great distress, and who's not there to make any decisions when the battle is going on. He orders that the remaining battleships and destroyers, and very few of them were hit, that they head toward the U.S. fleet for a night action. This is where the Japanese would be able to have an extremely good chance. If the U.S. couldn't have any aircraft in the battle, their surface ships are inferior to the Japanese, at least in numbers, and he could have done tremendous amount of damage if they could catch up with the United States fleet in time to destroy the carriers with surface gunfire. But then, as that's underway, he realizes, I'm sure his staff had to convince him, that there was no way that his ships could reach the U.S. fleet in darkness, and that if daylight came, then they would be the ones under air attack, and he would probably lose a lot more ships. So, with great reluctance, Yamamoto decided to call off the invasion, call off the attack, and head back for Japan with a fleet that was much, much less useful or effective than the fleet that had left Japan and numerous other starting points. The Yorktown survived 2 attacks, but on its way back, being towed to Honolulu, one of the Japanese submarines finally found the U.S. ship, and it fired a spread of torpedoes. It sunk both the Yorktown and its escorting destroyer. So in the battle, we lost virtually every airplane that had been based at Midway, except for the Army B-17s, and 1 aircraft carrier, and every torpedo plane, and most of the torpedo pilots, and a few others. But it was a tremendous victory for the United States. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. The odds totally changed from what they had been 2 days before. I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened to at least a few of the participants. Admiral Spruance, I don't have his picture here, but he went on to become Chief of Staff to Nimitz, and then to head one of the 2 the largest carrier attack forces that ever did or ever will sail the seas. Ensign Gay, the sole survivor of the torpedo squadron from the Hornet. He was sent on a war bond tour all around the country, but he went back to the fleet, back into action, survived the war. He became a pilot for TWA, and he flew for many years. And
Brady, you froze up again.
he was diagnosed with serious lung issues. He was sent back to the U.S., retired, medical retirement, with perhaps only months to live. For the next 30 years or so, he lived, played a lot of golf, and was in perfect health, but never again the opportunity to fly a plane for the U.S. Navy. Admiral Stanhope Ring, the man who led the Flight to Nowhere, and whose squadrons, other than the torpedo squadrons, played no meaningful role, got promoted to captain. He commanded an aircraft carrier just at the end of the war. He was promoted again to admiral, commanded a group of aircraft carriers. He came out just fine. Commander Rochefort, whose intelligence work almost single-handedly put the U.S. in position to participate in this battle, let the commanders know exactly what was going to happen, when it was going to happen. If there was ever a hero of an encounter who did not actually participate in the encounter, it was certainly Joe Rochefort. So what happens to Joe Rochefort? The people in Washington who really knew nothing about the kind of work he did, but who were in charge, got him transferred. He never again in the war was engaged in code breaking. He was sent to supervise the building of a floating dry dock, and later in the war was involved in the intelligence evaluation operation, evaluation of what was going to happen in Japan after the war. But the real hero, he never engaged in code breaking again. Now there's a really great book, one of many books about Midway, called Incredible Victory. And in the preface to the book, I'd like to read from it, because you won't be able to read part of it's reproduced here, but they had no right to win, yet they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of a war, even against the greatest of odds. There is something in the human spirit, a magic blend of skill, faith, and valor that can lift men from certain victory, certain defeat, to incredible victory. And I think we are exactly out of time now for the presentation. I hope that if you have some questions, and I do say that we have some chat messages. Oh my, it keeps freezing up. I assume you mean my screen was. That's a shame. I hope that didn't happen too many times. Rachel says, when I worked for the Navy Department at Wallops Island, we had an annual commemoration of the Battle of Midway. It was a very nice tradition, and that was a very nice tradition. And I think it's a battle, if you're going to remember things about World War II, the Battle of Midway, in my judgment, is one of the most significant and important things. Now, I see why you're freezing up. I'm getting a message again saying your internet connection is unstable. Paul says, John Ford filmed the battle on Midway Island. That is quite true. That is a very interesting film to watch. That if you, I think it's included among other places in the Victory at Sea series. And probably with everything in the world on YouTube these days, you probably can find it on YouTube. Theresa Murray says, it seems politics punished Rochefort and promoted the incompetent rag. Well, that is exactly what happened. I imagine that all of you who have worked in an organization where there was more than one location or operation saw the kind of infighting that goes on among the people at headquarters who want to run everything and the people in the field who think that they should at least run everything in their area and maybe something else. It was in a way typical, but also extremely unfortunate that the Navy let this happen. And in fact, Nimitz was urged to try and prevent this from happening. Admiral King agreed with his people in Washington, and Nimitz finally said, look, there are only so many times that there are only so many things I can do, and my disagreements with Admiral King, and on this one I'm going to have to pass. And unfortunately, he did pass. Fortunately, though, people he had trained and helped to train were able to mount a very effective code breaking and traffic analysis operation that were very important in the rest of the war. Now, it says here, Theresa Murray, direct message. I'm not sure what that means, but it doesn't say anything on my screen. Well, if anyone has any other comments or questions, I'd be happy to take them. If not, I want to thank everyone for your attention. I'll wait here another.
Mike, I'll ask a question.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think Ring benefited from his history with Roosevelt in being advanced to admiral?
I think that his, I wouldn't say it was covered up, but Michener, the commanding officer of the ship, also looked bad because of this. And indeed, he did not right away get as good a job as he might have expected. But I think that part of it was in the reporting of it, and indeed failure to report. The squadrons and ships are supposed to file detailed reports right after a battle of what happened. Well, Ring's squadron never filed a report, and the Hornet never filed a report.
Wow.
So a lot of it is a lot of the reason he managed to survive, I think, is because the information didn't manage to get back to the people who might have done something for a while. And I think, you know, he probably, when he did get somewhere else, he continued to look the part, look like a naval officer ought to look like, and impress people, and kept his head low and kept getting promoted.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, Waldron died, so he wasn't, you know, he was the person that had first said, "You're crazy, I'm going where this is supposed to be happening," and obviously he was right, but he died.
That's right.
without. So,
he was absolutely right.
Yeah. So politics.
It's a shame to have to get a ship named after yourself, because
Yeah. Right.
that means you it didn't end well for you.
Right. you can
But
see why.
Waldron was one of the true heroes of this battle. Because he gave his life, and he got it right.
Yeah. I mean,
Well-
essentially it was like mutiny and, but he was right. And it was a very large cost, for that bad decision or bad evaluation.
Yeah.
Mike,
If you have to say anything in Ring's defense, he probably, or she certainly did assume that he was flying the right course.
Yeah.
And that he, being senior, knew more than Waldron, but he was wrong, Waldron was right, and
Right.
the rest, as we say, is history.
Yeah. Sad.
Mike,
Sad.
All right, I guess we are out of time. I much appreciate your
Oh.
comments. I'm sorry that there was problem with the picture. I hope it wasn't too bad. I'll try to get a debriefing after the lesson. But again, thank you all very much. Larry, if you're still there,
Oh, I'm
thank
still here.
you, and thank Mac so very much. We appreciate your help on this, and we will see you next week, same
Next week, yep.
time, same station.
Sounds
Thank you
good.
very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Mm.